Football season is almost here. Anyone excited about that? A few folks. All right. So we know that every football team has a quarterback, at least one quarterback, and always just one on the field at a time. But countless armchair quarterbacks. And there are many differences between the quarterback and an armchair quarterback, not the least of which is if you're watching the game from the stands or from the comfort of your home or from a restaurant or a bar someplace, you have absolutely zero responsibility for your team winning, right? You can't do a thing. You can predict the plays. You can certainly see which plays should have been called or ought to be called, and where the quarterback should have thrown the ball and how they should have thrown the ball. But none of that is your responsibility. All of that is on someone else. It's on the shoulders of the quarterback. The quarterback is on the field. The quarterback not only has to know everything that the armchair quarterbacks know, which is, let's admit it, a lot. It's a lot. But the quarterback actually has to make it happen. The quarterback has a job to do. Now, I have never been good at playing football. I'm not good at watching football in the sense that when the ball is snapped and everyone starts to move, the best I can do is keep my eye on the ball. I don't even always manage that. All of the amazing complexity of the moves and what each position is doing and ideally perfect timing and synchronicity, it is beyond the ability of my brain to comprehend. It appears to be chaos to me. When I listen to an interview with quarterbacks like, Tom Brady or any of the NFL level quarterbacks, really, and they talk about everything they have to think about and everything they have to see. That's one of the reasons I like Tony Romo's my favorite commentator. I know that's not the case for everybody, but he'll break it down and talk about just what everyone's going to do before they do it, and then they do it. And they have a whole vision of what's happening on the field, what's going to happen on the field, and how to respond to that, and when and where and what to do. To me, it's chaos. To them, it's an opportunity. And that's Joseph's position. The position Joseph found himself in Egypt was the position of quarterback, if you will, with Pharaoh being the head coach. He was the leader. He was in charge, and there was chaos that was coming. First, it was the chaos of prosperity that was going to be there. And as we looked at when we were talking about our warning to America, prosperity can create as many or more problems in a nation as deprivation can. And when everything's going well for 7 years in a row, most folks aren't thinking about what awful things are going to happen down the road. They're thinking about how good the stock market's doing. And then the stock market crashes, or the rain stops falling and the dust comes in, and a different type of chaos comes. And that's what happened in Egypt. The famine started. And in the first of the 7 years, it was already terrible. And it was chaos. If you're a regular person in Egypt or anywhere in that part of the world at that time, your only thought is, how in the world am I going to get food for me and my family? And if you can't grow it and your neighbors can't grow it, where are you even going to buy it and find the food? What are we going to do? Now, it's easy to sit back from, how many thousands of years distant are we? Some close to 3,000 years, I think, from Joseph here. And it's easy to armchair quarterback it from this distance. It's easy to pick apart what Joseph did and didn't do. And I've heard some people do it. Joseph, acting as an agent for the king, for Pharaoh, set up a system where during the years of plenty, 20% of all that was produced went to the Pharaoh by tax, from everyone from everywhere. And they stored it up and they saved it. And then when the famine hit, they didn't just dole out food to hungry people. The first year the famine hit, Joseph said, yeah, I can sell you some food. Give me all your money. And they got all their money. And then the next year the people came back and there was still a famine. And they said, we need more food. And Joseph said, we got food. Give me all your livestock. And they gave him all his livestock, their livestock. And the third year, when they came back, it was, give me all your land. And they gave all their land to the Pharaoh through Joseph. And then, in the next year, the only thing they had left to give were themselves. And they basically entered into indentured servitude, slavery to the king. And that's how Joseph managed the famine. Made the king a very rich man. I suspect Joseph did well by himself through that whole process too. Now, we're sitting 3,000 years after the events, in the middle of immense prosperity, not having any idea really what famine is like, unless you happen to be living through the Great Depression. You would have some sense of that, but I think even everyone was living through the Great Depression was pretty young then, and maybe you don't have a great sense of that. But we have no responsibility. We have no responsibility for managing Egypt. We have no responsibility for managing the prosperity or the famine, for keeping people alive, for keeping the government running and intact, for maintaining a system that, while causing a lot of problems and a lot of difficulties for a lot of people, frankly saved a lot of lives. Joseph doing what Joseph did. We can armchair quarterback it. Joseph had to lead it. He had to live through it. And he had to lead it. He didn't have to, I guess. Well, I don't know. It depends on whether you can turn down an order from Pharaoh or not. Pharaoh put him in charge. I suppose he could have said no, but he didn't. And in the midst of all of that chaos, Joseph stepped up and led. Joseph, who had gone from being the little brother that was favored by his father and hated by his older brothers, to a slave, to the head of his owner's household, to a prisoner, to being put in charge of everyone in the prison, to now being second in command in the kingdom, second only to the king himself, to Pharaoh himself, leading Egypt through an immensely difficult and challenging time in its history. And he rose to the occasion. He did what he needed to do. Pharaoh asked them. He was talking to his advisors here, and what Aubrey read at the beginning was what Joseph's recommendation: find a wise, discerning person, put them in charge of all of this. And Pharaoh asks his advisors, can we find anyone like this guy? And he pointed to Joseph, one in whom is the Spirit of God. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. I wonder how, there's a commercial out, I watch too much TV. There's a commercial out, I think it's a British commercial. And it's the social media police. When people say dumb things on social media, they show up at their house. And they show up at this one guy's house, knock on his door, and they said, are you whatever. I said, yep, that's me. He said, did you say that during the fight the other night that so-and-so should have been a man and taken more punches? Yes, I did. Do you stand by that? Yes, I do. Well, here's the fighter. And he comes up and punches him. And, armchair quarterbacks usually aren't up to the task of leadership. It's a whole different ballgame, second guessing and evaluating and criticizing, than it is to actually leading. Sadly, I think, far too often in our culture and in our history, church has played the role of armchair quarterback in the world. Armchair quarterbacking the decisions of politicians, left, right, or middle. Armchair quarterbacking the decisions of business people that are employing tens, hundreds, thousands. Armchair quarterbacking the decisions of their neighbors across the road or across town. Armchair quarterbacking the decisions of their children or the decisions of their parents. Armchair quarterbacking the coaches at the school or the teachers at the school or the principals at the school. Armchair quarterbacking mayors and council and trustees and everyone. And the church has gotten very good at least on a superficial level, of doing what I was talking about last week, which is speaking prophetically, if that's the nicest way we could say it. Well, God says this is what we ought to be doing. God says this is the way it ought to be. And sometimes we get it right about that. But the problem is, just saying it isn't enough. Joseph didn't just tell Pharaoh what was going to happen. He didn't just say to Pharaoh, this is what God is going to. He did say those things. He did warn Pharaoh. He did point out the truth to Pharaoh. But then he also stepped up and led the way through it. He took action. He put his life, his reputation, his time, his energy, his resources on the line to lead into the very things he said God was going to be doing. That's the difference between being an armchair quarterback and being a quarterback. It's not enough for the church to simply be discerning and prophetic. We also need to lead sometimes. We need to step out. We need to take the risks. We need to put our money where our mouth is. We need to invest our time, our energy, our efforts, our reputations, our resources into leading into the directions that we are so convinced that God is saying our country, our community, our family needs to go. Now, there's a lot of, this is not a sermon just on how to be a great leader, because it's not. And you can find, books all over Amazon, or if there are any bookstores around anymore, you can find them there too, on how to be a great leader. But I want to look at some things in Joseph's leadership as he was leading that I think we can model, we can learn from, and replicate in our life in the world today. First of all, as a leader, Joseph had faith and was filled with the Holy Spirit. And that's repeated in one form or another multiple times throughout chapter 41 in Genesis. That Joseph had faith, was filled with the Holy Spirit. Joseph was discerning. Joseph was a man of God. God was with Joseph. We hear that over and over and over and over again. And if we as a church want to be leaders in this world as a group or as individual Christians, we need faith, and we need to be sure that we are seeking to be filled continually with the Holy Spirit. Because if it's just us, if it's just you, just me, if we're just doing our thing and doing our best and working our hardest, then we're no different than anybody else in the world. We might be a little more or a little less competent than other folks, but we're no different than other folks. The difference that Joseph had wasn't just his competence, and we're going to get to that, because Joseph was a very competent leader, a very competent manager. But he was also filled with the Holy Spirit. He also had faith. It took faith during years of prosperity to take 20% of the income away from everyone in the country. That was not popular. I can assure, because this guy, he was a slave 2 weeks ago, and now he's telling us what God's going to do. Everything's going great. What do you mean it's going to be awful in a few years? How does he know that? He's some dumb Hebrew. He's not even an Egyptian. He's not educated properly. Why are we listening to this guy? But Joseph believed God. He had faith in God. He believed that God was going to do what God said he was going to do, and he knew that the best thing for the country was to act on that as if God was going to do what he said he was going to do, even if people complained about it, even if people fussed about it, even if people argued about it, even if enemies resisted what he was doing. Now, we don't get any of that part of the story. I can't imagine that it didn't happen, though. Can you imagine? If a president of the United States raised up and put someone in charge who wasn't even a citizen here to be in charge of everything in the country, and gave that person the power to tax you and everyone you know, can you imagine how people would respond to that? Particularly if the response of the president to the complaint was, well, he says God's going to do this, so we better get ready. Oh my goodness. It would have been chaos. But Joseph was filled with the Holy Spirit. throughout all of his trials, throughout, I was going to say ups and downs, but it was really downs and more downs. For the past 20 years of his life, he stayed connected with God. He stayed trusting in God. He stayed faithful to God. And the Spirit of God stayed with him. And that was part of his leadership. The other part was he had to work. This was not, leadership is not easy. Anyone who's ever led anything knows that. But to do the work that Joseph had to do the kind of leadership he had to do, would have been a massive amount of work. I fuss like other people do about the ultra rich and billionaires and now trillionaires. Elon. I tell you what, I've read Elon Musk's biography. There's a really good biography of him out there. This is a hardworking group of people in front of me right now. I would wager Elon Musk puts in more hours a week than maybe anybody in this room. He works crazy amounts. I'll just sleep at the office for a month because I'm closer to the work, is Elon Musk. He's a little crazy. You read the book and he's a little crazy. But work is hard. I don't know how else you lead 4 different companies if you're not going to work at it. Work is hard. The work of a president is hard. The work of a quarterback is hard. The work of a school teacher is hard. The work of a judge is hard. The work of a mayor is hard. These kinds of leading people is one of the hardest things in the world to do. Because it's like leading cats sometimes, they just all want to do their own thing, and everyone is an armchair quarterback and they know what we ought to be doing anyway. We have to do the work. Rarely does God just drop sacks of gold out of heaven to solve problems. He brought water from a rock in the wilderness and manna from the air in the wilderness. That was after every other resource was gone and exhausted, and there was nothing the children of Israel could do to provide for themselves. God did that miraculously. God didn't miraculously drop extra food. The assignment wasn't, Joseph, pray for the 7 years, and then for the 7 years of famine, I'll just magically refill the grain bins. And I'll magically, keep the livestock alive. Oh, it was work. It was gather all of this. It was collect all this. It was figure out how to store all of this so the vermin can't ruin all of this. Figure out how to store all of this so mold and mildew doesn't destroy all of this. Because this that you're storing now has to last for 7 years at least, with no refrigeration and no electricity and none of that. No fans even. At least mechanically run. And Joseph had to figure out how to get the stuff. He had to figure out how to store the stuff. He had to build buildings. It was a crazy amount of work. Leadership requires work. Not just sitting back and saying, hey, I'm telling you what God says now. We'll just wait for God to do it. It's, hey, God says he's going to do this. We got a lot of work to do. Joseph was not deceived by prosperity. It's very important. Talked about this already a couple of weeks ago, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. But it would have been so easy during that 7 years of prosperity to sit back and say, you know what, maybe I was wrong about this. Everything's going great. Let's just ride this wave. Let's not make people unhappy by taking their stuff. Let's just ride it out and see how long it goes. Joseph was not deceived by that. He didn't get lazy during prosperity. He didn't forget to trust God during prosperity. He didn't forget that God was really sovereign even during prosperity, and that no amount of wealth gained during that time of prosperity was going to be enough to keep people alive for the next 7 years without the work that Joseph was doing. He was not deceived by prosperity. As a leader, Joseph was not panicked by bad news. This is another area where I feel the church, again, if you base your evaluation of the church on social media, which is never good to base really evaluation of anything on social media, but every time something bad happens, there's Christians on social media talking about it's the end of the world and this is terrible. It's like we have the Satan and Christians just seem to go nuts at the slightest things, and that everything is awful, everything's a disaster, everything's a sign of the apocalypse, and Jesus is coming back tomorrow, and it's all terrible, and it's all... Joseph didn't panic at the bad news. Joseph understood. If Joseph had learned anything in the last 20 years of his life, it's that there's bad news. And no matter how good you think things are today, you might be a slave tomorrow. No matter how great things are today, you might be in prison tomorrow. There's bad news, but God is faithful through the bad times, just like God is faithful through the prosperous times. And when bad things happen, when the wrong person gets elected, when the wrong policy gets decided on, when the wrong law gets passed, when the wrong decision is made in court, when the wrong decision is made in military, when all of these things happen, because there will always be wrong decisions, God is still king. God is still in charge. And our task as leaders in this world is to keep our eyes fixed and focused on God. So when the bad news comes, we're like, yeah, it's bad news. It's a storm. But Jesus, but God. When Jesus panics, then it's time to panic. But while the disciples were panicked, Jesus was taking a nap. He's like, can you guys shut up already? I'm trying to sleep. Joseph wasn't panicked by the bad news. As people of faith, as followers of God, we need not be panicked by the bad news. As a leader, Joseph looked beyond himself. He knew that it was more than just about him. This is another thing he'd learned in the last 20 years of his life, that his life was not about him. He had found himself in a country where he didn't want to be, in a position where he didn't want to be, in a prison where he didn't want to be, as a slave that he didn't want to be, and now he's put in charge of the entire kingdom, whether he wants to be or not. But it wasn't about him. He knew that famine was coming. There was not only an entire nation of people, but an entire region of people who would be dying in 7 short years, would be dying unless he did the work that God put in front of him to do to make sure that there was food available for people to buy so that they could live. This wasn't a glory trip for him. This wasn't a power trip. This wasn't a climb the corporate ladder. This wasn't a see how much I can get for myself. This was the people of this country and this world are depending on me to stay faithful to God and to do the work that God puts in front of me. Because it's not just about me. It's about the people around me too. Joseph, as a leader, he faced the problem straight on. No sugarcoating, no pretending, just straight on. No avoiding. One of the I think great spiritual movements of the 20th century, and it's still going today, is the AA 12-step recovery movement. And if you haven't familiarized yourself with that directly or indirectly, then I encourage you to check it out. There's great spiritual stuff in there. And one of the core prayers in AA is a prayer. They usually use a shorter version of it, a prayer written by Reinhold Niebuhr, a Christian theologian of the 20th century. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. That's the short version of the prayer. And that's a prayer that a lot of addicts will pray on a regular, ongoing basis, or when they're hit by temptation. They have in their literature the full version of the prayer, which Niebuhr wrote, which, I'm going to see if I can do this without having to open my phone because I forgot to open my phone. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the wisdom to know the difference. God, give me the serenity. I've already messed it up. God, give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking this world as Jesus did, taking this world as it is, as Jesus did, not as I would have it. That I might be reasonably happy with you in this life, and that I might be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Accepting what I can't change. Courage to change what I can. There was no change in that a famine was coming. What can we change? We can change what we do with the food during the 7 years of plenty. We don't party hardy and eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, because then tomorrow we will die. We're going to take the food, we're going to store it, force people to give up a major portion of it now so that they'll have some later. Taking the world as it is, not as I would have it. I love that line in that prayer. This world is not as I would have it. So I'll just be right up front about that. God did not put me in charge. There's a good reason for that. I would mess it up. This world is not as I would have it. There's so many things I'd like to change about this world. But the world comes to us as it is. And it doesn't design itself according to our whims and wishes and even according to our needs or wants. It just is what it is. And we have to respond to it as it is. And that's what Joseph did. He faced it straight on, head on, without sugarcoating, without denial, without pretending that things were different than they are. And as a leader, Joseph took responsibility for dealing with a problem that he did not create. We waste, people inside the church and outside the church these days waste far too much time hunting around for who's responsible, in the sense of whose fault is this? Who can we blame? Who made the mess? It's all well and good. It's nice to find out who made the mess. Much more important to sort out who's going to clean up the mess. Joseph didn't make this mess. This wasn't his mess. He wasn't even supposed to be there. He was supposed to be back in Canaan, telling his brothers how they were doing their jobs wrong. That was his job. And then he was a slave, and then he was a prisoner, and now he's in charge. And now his job is to deal with the problem that he didn't create. And it's going to consume his life for at least the next 14 years and alter the course of history for the entire world. Because it was Joseph's work that kept God's covenant promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because without the work that Joseph did, Abraham and Isaac had died by now, but Jacob and his family would have all been dead, and God's plan of salvation would have been stopped. But Joseph took responsibility for a problem that he didn't create, and he worked really hard to help clean up the mess. One of the greatest examples, I think, of this kind of leadership, it's a real-life example from a few years back during the days of desegregation. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Remember the Titans. Anyone ever seen that? In my humble opinion, best football movie ever made. If you haven't seen it, watch it. It's a wonderful movie. It's got Denzel Washington in it. What more could you want? And it's set in Virginia, and two high schools, or actually, I think it was historically, I think it was three high schools were forced together, a black school and two white schools. But in the movie, it was a black school and a white school. And both had very dominant and very successful football programs. And they were forced together, and their football team was forced to integrate. And the black coach from the black school was put in charge of the football team as the head coach. And he had a mess that he did not create. He had chaos. He had players fighting against players, players undermining players, parents undermining the team, community members undermining the team, people trying to undermine him. If he lost a single game, he could lose his job. No pressure. And there he was in the middle of all of that. And he could have said, "This is not my fault. Not my circus, not my monkeys. I'm getting out of here." He could have said, "This is not fair." Of course, it wasn't fair, but the world doesn't care whether things are fair or not. He said, "It's not fair. I shouldn't have to do this." People years ago hadn't done all of this silly race division stuff, we wouldn't be in this mess now. Absolutely true. Absolutely irrelevant. He was in the middle of it, and he had to lead. He didn't have to lead. He accepted the responsibility to lead through chaos and a mess that he did not create. Of course, it was a Disney movie. They did well. If they'd done poorly, Disney wouldn't have made a movie about it. So, watch the movie. It's really, really good. But as he challenges his team, as he challenges his assistant coaches, as they have to work through the problems not just of football tactics and strategies to deal with the team next week, but how do we get the white players and the black players not to hate each other? and to work together? And how do we decide who's going to play and who's going to be on the bench? How do we decide which coach is going to get credit for what sorts of things, which coach is going to be in charge of what aspect of the team? All of these things. And he worked, and he worked, and he worked, and he worked. And the white coach, assistant coach, who was the defensive coordinator, Yost, Bill Yost, I think was his name. He had to humble himself and accept a lower level of leadership than he would have had the schools not been forced together. He had to say to the folks, hey, we're going to sabotage Coach Boone so that you can take over. And he had to rat them out and refuse to play their games. Because sometimes leading means we're not the one in charge, but we're one of the ones that are under the one in charge, but we have our own things to lead and we have our own responsibilities that we have to take care of, because not everyone is in the position of Joseph. Not everyone's the head coach. Not everyone's the quarterback. But we all have opportunities to lead, to influence folks around us. Part of our identity as followers of Jesus is that we can be leaders even in the middle of chaos. Because we know that Jesus is not panicked. Jesus is not worried. He's not anxious. He wasn't anxious when he'd been beaten and whipped and stood in front of Pontius Pilate. And Pilate's like, I can do this to you. And Jesus is like, my dad's in charge. Our dad's in charge, whatever chaos is happening. And if we can keep our eyes on Jesus and we can faithfully trust in him and faithfully follow him, we can do so much more than just tell the world what's wrong. There's enough people playing that role of telling the world what's wrong. We can be people who accept the responsibility for cleaning up messes that we didn't make, for doing the hard work of bringing people together who disagree and fuss and fight and argue and this, that, and the other to accomplish goals that will benefit not just us, not just our family, but the whole community and the whole region. This is the call that we have as followers of Jesus, to accept our identity to be leaders even in the midst of chaos.